Hello and welcome everyone to the webinar today. There'll still be a few people joining for the first few moments, but I'm just going to jump right in. So today we're going to transport you back in time to the early 2000s, and we're going to examine the Texas City explosion of 2005 and the events that led up to it in the many years prior. So no matter what industry that you work in, my promise to you today is that I will have something for you to take away that you can use in your day-to-day. And in fact, before I even begin, I want you to make a promise to me. If you could take out a pen and a piece of paper, and at some point during this discussion, I'd like you to write down something that you can start on immediately. Not next year, not next month, or even next week. Something that if you chose to do, you could start today. And if you like, please write it in the Q&A in Microsoft Teams, and I can read some out at the end. And just on that, if you've got any questions, please write them in the Q&A and I'll answer them at the end. So on the 23rd of March 2005, 15 people tragically lost their lives and almost 200 were seriously injured. This disaster was no accident. It was predictable and it was preventable. And I'll reveal the catalogue of errors, the misguided decisions and the missed opportunities to spot the danger. But I implore you not to think of yourself as being immune from this. Although this exact chain of events will almost certainly never repeat itself, many of these key contributing factors have been repeated many times since, and they likely will be repeated many times again. In fact, as I reflected while I was writing this, I've realised that I myself have been directly involved or a silent bystander in some similar and misguided decisions. So whilst I've worked incredibly hard to research and prepare this content for you, I am very much standing on the shoulders of others that have come before me. So these are the four primary sources that I've got to recognise here, and I would encourage anyone who's interested after today to watch or read these themselves. I'll show this slide at the end of today again, but that's the CSB 15-year anniversary into Texas City, Failure to Learn by Andrew Hopkins, Spills and Spin by Tom Berrigan, and the first episode of the Causality podcast. And just one small disclaimer before we jump in, I have removed or simplified some details from the chain of events on the day simply to make sure that we cover the key points. I don't believe this changes any of the conclusions, but I do encourage you to do some further reading. So let's jump in. We'll start with this quote from Eva Rowe. "My parents were my best friends. They're all I had. My life ended that day. BP ruined my life. It ended my life. And that day I had to start over." So these are the words of Eva Rowe, who sadly lost both of her parents in the Texas City disaster. But we've actually got a lot to thank her for. She was one of many who took legal action against BP. And as part of that settlement, they were forced to disclose far more information than we would usually see from other similar accidents. And this was done so that others could learn. So let us not waste this opportunity. So the BP Texas City refinery was a monster. It was built in 1934 and it was the company's largest refinery in North America. It employed almost 2,000 people and it could process over 450,000 barrels of crude oil each day. Up until 1998, 7 years before the disaster, it had been owned by Amoco. And when I say monster, Texas City really was a monster. It had been crippled by years of mismanagement and years of underinvestment. If you'd walked past the refinery in 2005, you would have seen broken windows, uncut grass, peeling paintwork, corroded pipework, and roofs in need of repair. We're not going to go into too much detail on the refinery process itself, but simply a refinery is a large industrial facility that takes crude oil in and it separates out into its various constituent parts. It might blend it with other products and it makes the useful everyday products like gasoline, diesel, and many other chemicals. Refineries have got multiple units. You can see them pictured here, and each design is to handle different parts of the process. For today, we're going to be looking solely at the isomerization or the ISOM unit, and that just simply helps convert hydrocarbons into higher quality forms. The two main pieces of equipment we're going to focus on are the large raffinate splitter tower that we'll be spending quite a bit of time on, and then on the right-hand side, that blowdown stack. That blowdown stack is part of a safety system that can help to relieve pressure in the tower. This system was first used in Texas City in the 1980s. So what was happening on the 23rd of March? Well, if you go back to the early hours of the morning, there was a routine startup of this unit. So this tower that I just showed you is 52 meters high, and you can refer to it as both the raffinate or the splitter tower. So how this works in operation, a small amount of liquid is added to the bottom, usually only 6 feet, 2 meters. This is heated up, and this allows lighter, less dense hydrocarbons to be separated from the heavier ones. And yet, normally 2 meters of liquid to function correctly. And if you've got too much or too little, it doesn't work exactly as designed. At the time of starting this unit up, there had just been a 4-week turnaround, and there was a large maintenance campaign. There was an extra 1,000 people on site. So to accommodate all these people, there were multiple additional temporary office trailers placed throughout the complex, and one set of these trailers was placed just 30 feet or 9 meters away from the blowdown stack, far closer than the recommended 350 feet. This was done simply for convenience. Refineries are huge, and this avoids workers having to walk long distances between site and their offices. Usually putting trailers unprotected close to dangerous equipment would require detailed safety reviews or the use of blast-proof trailers. However, no such reviews were conducted, and these trailers were made of wood and not in any way blast-proof. So returning to the incident, this 4-week maintenance campaign is over, and operators are now beginning the process of starting up the ISOM unit. And this simply involves injecting a liquid called raffinate, or RAF, into the bottom of the tower. Now, although 2 meter is the optimal level, the unit did have a maximum operating height of 3 meters. Operators routinely, deliberately overfilled this tower at startup. There was a perceived risk that fluctuating liquid levels might damage a furnace. So there was a level indicator which could only measure up to 3 meters. That actually failed to capture any level above that. So there was an initial high level alarm was activated at 3 o'clock in the morning, and that's usually what lets operators know that they've pushed it too far. There was a secondary alarm that failed, and due to a lack of clear logs and a miscommunication between teams, operators continued to add RAF to the already overfilled tower. Now, as a side note, I mentioned there was an alarm that didn't go off. That had actually been noted as faulty 2 years prior. Work orders were raised to resolve that, but they were closed without the work having ever been performed. Due to staffing cuts that we'll get to later, there was a single control room operator who was overseeing this startup, and he was working a 12-hour shift and had been working for 30 days straight. There was no fatigue management policy in place at the time, although most onshore refineries globally would have capped this at around 21 consecutive shifts. There was also no face-to-face handover, or there was no detailed written log. The night shift simply wrote, ISOM brought some raft into the unit. A face-to-face handover is crucial in many industries, particularly during time-sensitive and critical and hazardous operations. A more robust handover would have played a real impact. So as the day progressed, I'll not cover all of them, but there was some critical mistakes made in what should have been a routine but hazardous operation. So, for example, there were conflicting instructions as to where to route the liquid raft to. So a valve that could have controlled the level in the tower, highlighted here in the circle, was left closed. The day supervisor who oversaw the control room operator had to leave unexpectedly just before 11 a.m. to attend a family emergency, and this left the remaining control room operator alone to be responsible for 4 separate units across the refinery, as well as the restart process, without any supervision. And remember, this gentleman was on his 30th consecutive 12-hour shift. So he did have experience of 4 startups previously with supervision, but there were actually 2 other more experienced operators on site, but they'd been deployed to alternative temporary positions for the ongoing campaign that offered higher pay. A single person should have been focused on that startup, let alone that startup and 4 other pieces of equipment to control. So if we fast forward a few hours, the liquid in the tower kept rising and rising until it reached a level of 98 feet, 30 meters high, 15 times the normal operating level. However, at the exact same time, the faulty level indicator showed that there was only 8.5 feet, 2.5 meters of liquid, and due to an issue with calibration, it showed the liquid level as falling. So this discrepancy misled operators. So they unknowingly just kept filling that tower. And with the furnace, kept heating the liquids, and that kept increasing the pressure in the tower. So at 12:41, shortly after lunch, there was a high pressure alarm at the top of the tower activated. But due to all the other information they had, the operators were confused as to how this could be the case. So they opened a manual valve, and this vented the gases to the atmosphere using that outdated blowdown drum that was first developed in the 1950s. So as they attempted to reduce pressure, they shut off burners and tried lots of very sensible things. But the real issue, which was the tower's dangerously high liquid level, remained completely undetected. Just as an aside on the blowdown stack, the risk of using these was well known, and in fact, across the refinery industry, the use of these had been phased out. The obvious flaw with something like a blowdown stack would be if heavy gas escapes, and the vapor might gather at ground level and could ignite. But not only had BP failed to phase out the outdated blowdown stack, they'd actually added additional lines to it. So they'd increased their reliance upon it rather than replacing it. There was 5 previous occasions in the few years leading up to Texas City when it was proposed to change this out with a flare, a system that just simply safely ignites the gas and minimises the risk of a vapour cloud gathering. But on each of these 5 occasions, due to cost, the request was denied. At Texas City, production was king. So now we're in the minutes leading up to the disaster. Around 1 p.m, the contract workers returned from a company lunch back to these trailers that were located very close to the blowdown stack. And these trailers were used as meeting rooms and offices. Right at this time, boiling liquid began overflowing into the vapour line, and it opened the emergency relief valves. And what was seen as a geyser of liquid at 1:14 after these relief valves opened, around 52,000 gallons of liquid was released from the blowdown stack, and they think that the vapor cloud was estimated to be an oil tanker full. This vapor cloud gathered on the ground. There was a series of alarms that were activated, but there was a high level alarm in the blowdown drum, but that was faulty and therefore wasn't activated. So again, the operators were unsure exactly what was happening. So this cloud spread rapidly and it engulfed the nearby trailers and the workers inside. Moments later, there was a truck that I'll just show you here that I'll highlight. So this is the blowdown stack here. There was actually a parked car here, and these are the trailers right next to the blowdown stack. So that truck was 7 meters away from the blowdown drum, and it backfired and it ignited the vapor cloud, and a powerful explosion followed. And I've actually got a photograph here, and you can see the blowdown drum marked in red. The raffinate splitter tower is the top middle, and unfortunately that is what is left of one of the nearby trailers. This explosion, its impact reached far beyond the immediate area. 3/4 of a mile away, there was homeowners that experienced shattered windows. Hundreds of people were injured. There was heavy men knocked to the ground with shockwaves, and many people suffered broken bones or deep gashes. There was people over 500 feet away that sustained injuries. And tragically, 15 people in the nearby trailers were killed almost instantly, including the husband and wife, James and Linda Rowe. There were some bodies so badly damaged that DNA testing was required to identify them. And horrifically, in Linda Rowe's case, the task was made even more difficult as her head had been severed by a piece of debris. Barbed wire around these units actually prevented some people from escaping, and there was 43,000 residents had to stay indoors whilst the fires were extinguished. There was many lengthy stays in hospital. In total, 170 people were taken to hospital. Some were never able to walk again. Others were left to cope with PTSD and survivor's guilt. So after years of warning, the disaster that many people had feared had happened, and the explosion of fires caused extensive damage, and the ISOM unit remained shut down for more than 2 years. That was my attempt to run through the key parts of the timeline. It's very difficult to do so with such a complex incident. There's just a few things that I would like to touch upon. I'd just like to zoom in on part of the incident timeline that I've made on Instant Insight. And you might be asking, how could so many of these things happen? Well, a useful way is to ask the 5 whys at key events. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? And eventually you might stumble upon a root cause. So you'd say, well, the blowdown drum, that vented gas to atmosphere, but why did that happen? Well, it happened because the gas wasn't flared. And that happened because there was no flare installed. And there was no flare installed because previous calls for a flare were rejected due to cost. Why were they rejected? Well, that's because the company focused too much on production rather than safety. And you can see here that senior leadership did not understand the impact that cost-cutting measures had on process safety. And if I just do one more, why was there an explosion? Yes, we should never be releasing gas and having a vapor cloud gather, but even so, there still has to be an ignition for there to be an explosion. Well, the explosion occurred because a vehicle was parked only 7 meters away from the blowdown drum. Why was the vehicle parked there? Well, there was no assessment of risk. And why did no one assess the risk of putting a truck there during startup? And that's because BP policy allowed running vehicles to be parked at the battery limits of any unit at any time. And that's simply because major accident risk at site was not understood. So there's many different ways to visualize an incident, but when you're really trying to find out why something happened, the 5 whys is a very useful way of doing so. But let's return to the incident. So this event was very much triggered on the day by people on site, and BP almost immediately fired 6 low-level employees. But this incident was caused by the decisions made many decades before, thousands of miles away at BP's corporate offices in London. So I'm going to explain these through 5 areas: a misunderstanding of process versus personal safety, a failure to learn from other incidents in the company, a flawed organisation, cost cutting, and not following procedures. So a crucial element of this disaster was a fundamental misunderstanding between process safety and personal safety, and this contributed significantly to decisions made. So personal safety refers to the higher frequency, this is on the bottom right, but lower consequence incidents such as slips, trips and falls, and they typically impact individuals or a very small group of people. But process safety, on the other hand, focuses on preventing the lower frequency but much higher consequence events such as fires and explosions or catastrophic structural damage. These types of incidents occur rarely, thankfully, but the impact, if they do, is devastating. And this isn't just about multiple lives, it can damage the environment and companies' assets. Imagine a company that makes cars. I think it would be very clear to everyone that the safety record of the staff on the factory floor where the cars are built tells us absolutely nothing about how safe those cars are on the road. And in much the same way, a strong personal safety record characterised by low numbers of injuries tells us very little about how a company is managing process safety. And this distinction is crucial, and we'll talk more about that shortly. But because BP's management had confused the two, they pointed to positive personal safety statistics, such as there had been a long time without a lost time injury, as evidence that the refinery was safe. And that led to misguided decision making. One executive was interviewed before the Texas City incident. He was quoted as saying, when he was asked about personal safety and process safety, he says, "I don't differentiate them in my mind." And that attitude permeated right through the organisation, and it shaped how safety was managed, and it shaped how safety was measured. There was lots of executives that had very clearly defined incentive structures. However, most of them had less than 10% of their bonuses were related to safety. And unfortunately, there was not a single process safety metric in any senior executive's bonus package, all focused on personal safety, such as reduction of lost time in injuries. It would have been very easy to add some process safety metrics into those. And managers were completely incentivized on reducing cost and increasing production. So not only were they not incentivized to effectively manage process safety, you could argue that they were actually incentivized not to manage it. It would have been very straightforward to use to implement some process safety KPIs, such as the number of unplanned safety excursions or unplanned cold venting. So before we leave this topic, I would say to you, how do you know that your team or your site or your company, how do you know how they're all performing in process safety? How is that being measured? And how do you know what action to take? Or like many, are you flying blind? Do you have meaningful KPIs in place? It's very tough to put these in place, but it's very easy to get started. Even without that, there's some things that you can do if you're a leader or a manager, or you've got a team that works for you. Here are some good examples of open questions that you can go out and ask those on site to get a far better understanding of how process safety is being managed at site. If these aren't questions that you're used to seeing or conversations that you're used to having, it might be that there's a slight disconnect between you and those out at site. So let's move on to the second part, failure to learn from other incidents. BP had a golden opportunity to prevent Texas City. 5 years before, far closer to home in Scotland, BP experienced a series of significant incidents at their Grangemouth refinery. Over a 13-day period in the year 2000, they had 3 major accidents. And these events sparked a large internal investigation, but also an investigation by the UK Health and Safety Executive. And that concluded that BP had endangered not only the lives of the workers at site, but of the civilians in the surrounding area. Incredibly lengthy report that I've taken summary from here, but the HSE attributed the Grangemouth incidents to poorly maintained equipment, aggressive cost-cutting measures that they felt compromised safety. In fact, the refining manager of Grangemouth had repeatedly requested additional funding to improve safety standards, but his persistence actually led to him being demoted rather than any action being taken. A very troubling culture in BP at that time, where clear financial constraints were prioritised over safety. And again, as the regulator highlighted, this is 5 years before Texas City, again, personal safety and process safety were being confused. In the year 2000, many in the industry had long since left, relying on injury rates to gauge overall process safety, but unfortunately, that hadn't happened in BP. The Health and Safety Executive in the UK recommended a renewed focus on process safety. They emphasised the need for key performance indicators, KPIs, ways to measure process safety performance. And they also highlighted that BP needed to develop a comprehensive understanding of major hazard safety, incorporating learnings from past incidents, both within their organisation and within the broader industry. And all of the noise out of BP at that time was fantastic. Their CEO said that the company would learn the lessons and apply them to their global operations. Publicly, BP had branded itself as a learning enterprise, and it had developed multiple peer groups to share knowledge and best practice. However, none of them were focused on safety. Rather, it was aimed at driving financial performance. So despite the fact that BP accepted the HSE's findings in full and publicly stated its commitment to change, shortly after this, an internal corporate restructure further undermined process safety. So in the name of increasing efficiency, the company devolved responsibility for safety compliance to individual business units, effectively meaning that they were all self-regulated. So the events at Grangemouth foreshadowed what was to come at Texas City, a failure to focus on process safety, but unfortunately these issues went unaddressed. And as I say, there's some of the information there. So I would ask, so the Grangemouth incidents, that was a wake-up call, but sadly the lessons weren't learned. So I would ask anyone on the call, think of an incident that's taken place in your organisation in the past year. What did you learn from it? Are you happy that everyone who needs to learn from it has learned? Would you say that the company has effectively implemented those learnings? And if not, why not? Now on to the third part, which is the flawed organisation structure. And understanding this organisational structure can really help you understand how the catastrophe was unfolding. So there's a few key players in this diagram here. So on the bottom left, you'll see the Texas City Refinery HSE manager and process safety manager. And right at the very top in purple, you'll see the group chief executive, and beneath him, you'll see the chief executive for refining and marketing. This is a very important person who comes up again quite soon. So the manager responsible for process safety at BP's largest refinery in North America was 5 levels removed from the executive suite, where the head of health and safety reported in. And the distance between frontline process safety management and the company's highest decision makers really symbolise that much deeper disconnect with BP's approach to process safety. So long before the explosion, there was repeated warning signs, as I've said, they could have triggered a top-level response. For example, in the 10 years before the disaster, there had been 6 major releases that had produced vapor clouds at Texas City. Astonishingly, only 2 of these were ever recorded in the safety incident database. Loss of containment incidents dramatically increased. In 2002, there was 399, but in 2004, and I've checked and double-checked this, there was 607 unplanned loss of containment, almost 2 per day. Yet instead of these numbers triggering action, increased vigilance or investment in safety, they were largely ignored. And that was because bad news simply wasn't reaching the top levels of the organisation, where critical decisions about safety and cost and spend could have been made. The leaders up here at the top remained oblivious to the growing risk, and they were insulated from the reality of day-to-day operations. Now, BP did trigger a lot of audits and a lot of reviews, and these were effective at finding the problems. So 1 year before, in 2004, there was a review done into company culture, and it concluded that there was an exceptional degree of fear of a catastrophic incident occurring at Texas City. And that was echoed by a separate review that described process safety issues as urgent and far-reaching. This review also highlighted that there was serious concerns about the potential for a major site incident due mainly to the very large number of hydrocarbon escapes, or hydrocarbon releases as we would call them here. There was an increasing backlog of overdue inspections that was noted too. Yet this report failed to inspire any action. None of these reports, and a few others that I've not got the time to go into, were read by the top executives. None of them. There was a systematic failure to listen in that organisation. Even when senior leaders visited Texas City, the disconnect persisted. So if you remember the person that I told us to focus on, the chief executive of the refining business, who sat just 1 level below the company's chief executive, he visited the Texas City site. And despite multiple reports that I've just highlighted, and there was so many more, he described leaving Texas City with a positive impression, not a negative one. However, during his deposition, he admitted that he didn't venture out onto the refinery. He didn't speak to many operational staff. Instead, he remained in the site offices, conferring only with site management. His comments after the disaster, for me anyway, reveal a huge flaw in BP's leadership structure. He was asked about these issues and he said, in order to find out about these safety issues, someone has to tell me about them. For me, the implications clear. Those at the top were not proactively seeking out the information that they needed to make informed safety decisions. And after the disaster, BP's newly appointed CEO, who becomes far more famous years later in a completely separate incident, but he concluded, we've got a leadership style that doesn't listen sufficiently well. The top of the organisation doesn't listen sufficiently to what the bottom is saying. This Texas City disaster explored a fatal flaw in BP's organisational structure. This wasn't just a failure of people on the day, of equipment or procedures. It was a failure to connect the different layers of an organisation. And just as an aside, and this is something I've experienced myself, there was a high level of executive turnover in BP. The average duration of company executives was 18 months. And these people were rewarded purely for profit and production. Therefore, very few major preventative maintenance initiatives across the refining part of the business were implemented at that time. And as I've said earlier, it wasn't that there wasn't, not only was there no incentive for these people not to do so, I actually think they were incentivized not to do these things. So again, I'd ask, if you're a leader, when was the last time that you were told bad news about process safety? And if you haven't been told any bad news about process safety for a while, then I would encourage you to start looking. So cost cutting played a pivotal role in this disaster. The economics at BP are highly complex at that time. They were highly profitable in many areas, such as their energy trading arm, which made £3 billion in profits in 2005 alone. But some areas, such as refinery, were left struggling. Although they were profitable, they had to they needed so much cash to run that the returns that they were receiving for the level of investment were not proportionate to other areas. At one point, BP's energy trading desk made 4 times as much money as all of its refineries combined. So it was very clear where the company was focusing its efforts, and unfortunately, refining was absolutely not a priority. It was the ugly sister to the trading arm. So this relentless pursuit of short-term profits, because remember, each executive's got 18 months to prove themselves, really hampered the long-term health of the business. And I believe that a lot of BP executives lost sight of the bigger picture. Costs had to be reduced almost regardless of the consequence. In fact, regardless of the consequences. And as I've said, refining being probably the least favoured part of the business really bore the brunt of these budget cuts. So if you think back to 2005, I'd said in 1998 there was a merger with Amoco. Amoco had already underinvested in Texas City. And instead of receiving a much needed financial boost, Texas City actually had further cost reductions under BP's ownership. There was a strange cultural clash in BP. There's usually a bit of negotiation about what's to be spent, whereas Amoco would just accept what came down. So actually they just accepted a lot of these cost targets without any negotiation. Many workers well into the early 2000s still were seen wearing their Amoco uniforms, and that's a visible reminder of this culture clash that emerged. The impact of this merger played a significant role. The CSB investigation concluded that restructuring following the merger resulted in a significant loss of people, expertise, and experience. Having a second operator on that panel, especially during the startup, would have made an enormous difference. So the impact of decisions to cut cost, mergers with other companies, these decisions, or the consequences of these decisions, often aren't felt many years after they've been made. So for example, all practical training at Texas City was ended to save money, and only computer-based training was performed. And only the most basic maintenance was performed as well. So there was lots of unsafe, outdated equipment that BP's competitors had long since replaced that still remained in use. This underinvestment led to low morale among staff, encouraged unsafe working practices, and I think made a dangerous environment. So for example, it was proposed to have plant process simulators at Texas City. These essentially mimic an entire unit, and they can mimic some operational issues and have the operators have to deal with them, but they were ruled out due to cost. In 2002, BP hired some consultants to review the Texas City plant. These were some people local to the site to try and get senior executives to listen. They told A.T. Kearney not to hold back, and they certainly did not. They concluded that cost reductions implemented after the merger were directly contributing to the declining state of infrastructure. This large number of fires that I touched on earlier were meaning there was a significant risk of a major accident. This audit found the condition of the infrastructure and assets at Texas City is poor, and it pointed directly to a checkbook mentality when it came to addressing safety concerns. In 2004, another review identified these same issues and again noted that the backlog of necessary repairs was continuing to grow and grow and grow. BP's cost cutting wasn't focused to Texas City by the way. There was a 25 blanket cost reduction across all refineries. There was a management review prior to the accident, and they stated bizarrely that given rising costs and giving increased expectations from the regulator, BP was choosing to rely, wherever possible, on more people-dependent and operational controls, rather than potentially opting for new hardware. Simply put, this means instead of replacing equipment, we're going to rely on our people. And by the way, they'd cut the number of people quite aggressively in some areas to cost cut. Anyone who knows anything about process safety knows that this approach is directly in conflict with the hierarchy of controls, which place engineering solutions above administrative or procedural fixes. For me, this memo also indicates that that Texas City would aggressively drive all costs out of the system at an accelerated pace. That quote for me about driving costs accelerated, that implies to me that many costs are seen as unnecessary. They're seen as excess, rather than understanding that no matter what, there are some costs that are simply critical to process safety. As I've said, all of this led to a blanket 25% reduction in costs across all refineries, regardless of a refinery's specific risk profile, its current condition, or its safety performance. Such an indiscriminate approach really ignores for me the reality of process safety. Another internal safety survey that, again, wasn't seen by the right people was completed in the months prior to the accident, and that concluded that production and budget compliance gets recognised and rewarded above anything else. Now, there was extra money allocated to maintenance. I've just said there was a 4-week maintenance campaign, but all of that work was on environmental compliance and incident response, not on preventative maintenance. Now, you'd have thought it might have dawned on someone that if you invested in preventative maintenance, then you might prevent these costly incidents. Now, look, every business strives to reduce costs and to increase profits. Cost control is a sound strategy. However, at BP, the disconnect was that senior leaders didn't grasp the impact that these cost-cutting decisions were having on process safety. You've got to remember that the true cost of neglecting safety isn't counted in money saved, it's counted in lives lost. And the final point before we finish is staffing and procedures. The investigation from CSB concluded that there were many outdated procedures which did not address recurring operational problems during startup. For example, as mentioned earlier, operators were concerned that during startup there could be fluctuating liquid levels, therefore they overfilled the liquid in the furnace. This was a perceived risk. It was actually unclear what this risk was, but it didn't matter because the operators believed that this was the case. This mentality was a contributing factor to the incident. The investigation revealed that operators believed that procedures could be altered or did not have to be followed during the startup process. And just for clarity, the startup procedure did not say to overfill the tower. There was a name for this culture of ignoring information. It was called casual compliance. So outdated procedures were simply treated as flexible guidelines, and the Board of Operations allowed the dangerous practice of marking steps as not applicable if they seemed unnecessary. This led to increased operator improvisation, which inevitably created dangerous situations, as we saw on the day. And again, due to cost cutting, there simply wasn't the level of supervision required to ensure that safe practices were being followed. So consider the practice of overfilling the tower. As mentioned earlier, this was common at Texas City. 14 of the 18 previous startups involved the tower being overfilled more than the operators actually thought it was, but none of these incidents were ever investigated. In fact, there was no system in place to measure whether the tower had overfilled or whether these procedures had been deviated from. There was actually no defined safe operating limit for that tower, and that just left workers at constant risk of severe danger. So those closest to the hazards, the engineers, the inspectors, and the superintendents, they expressed what one audit called an intensity of worry, but their fears never once translated into action from the executive level. Again, just as an aside, You might remember that I said that the operators thought that the liquid was coming down when it was going up. Well, this level transmitter it transpired was calibrated from data from a different type of liquid in 1975. So the level transmitter had never been accurate. There was a sight glass on the tower as well, but that was so dirty that it was unreadable. So there was actually no way for the operators to correctly verify the actual liquid level in the tank. For a design like that, should an appropriate study have been performed, such as a LOPA, I think almost certainly it would have concluded that multiple function-tested level transmitters would be required. Just a final point on the control room. Due to cost cutting, the number of operators was reduced from 2 to 1. And we saw on the day, this is the exact screen that they were, or multiple screens that they were looking at. The flow in and out of the tower were on separate screens. It was impossible to show them at the same time. So to quickly see the difference between flow going in and flow going out was not easy at all. Perhaps if they were on the same screen, it might have jumped out at the operator. The final couple of points I want to talk about, the trailers being so close to major equipment was perhaps the most fatal of all the mistakes. The change management process completely failed. BP did have a process in place to assess the risk of temporary trailers on site and to put in place restrictions that would need to be put in if they were within 350 feet. But not only did this risk assessment not address these, there was actually other outstanding actions that had not been closed prior to them being used. If you've got key internal governance documents, these should be used. And I can just show that very quickly before we finish off. So the explosion occurred and there were 15 fatalities because there were 15 people in the area. And again, if we go back to the 5 whys, asking why, well, there were 15 fatalities because there were people working in trailers near the units. Why was there people there? Well, these trailers had been sited adjacent to the ISOM for convenience of the turnaround activities. Why had they been sited there? Well, no risk assessment had been performed. Why had no risk assessment been performed? Well, BP's building analysis procedure wasn't followed. This actually breaks into a few things. Why? Well, there was lack of training about how to use it, when and how to use these things. And again, cost cutting had removed all but essential training. That's the root cause there. There was ineffective oversight of MOC. And again, each business unit had to self-govern. So they all managed these things or govern these things in a slightly different way. And finally, the management of change checklist didn't actually explicitly refer to the building analysis procedure. And again, as I've said, many procedures and policies were outdated. So to finish off then, maybe just one final point about the management of SIMOPS, simultaneous operations. Nobody working in these trailers, which were simply makeshift offices, there was no protection, there was no hard hats, there was no overalls. None of these people were aware that the dangerous startup was underway. Now, although a startup might be classed as routine doesn't mean safe. The startup of equipment like this is highly hazardous. Anyone that's got the potential to be impacted by a hazardous operation should at least be aware that it's ongoing. It would have been incredibly easy to move these people away from the trailers for the startup period, and that decision alone may have saved 15 lives. And before we leave procedures, just one thing to say, are there any outdated procedures that you are using or any outdated governance documents that you know that nobody really follows? Well, now's the time to request to have these reviewed and revised. So in conclusion, you don't need to be an expert in refineries or level indication or raffinate towers to prevent accidents like this. What's required is a commitment, an action, and a willingness to learn and to listen. There's a few key takeaways that I go back through again. Are you using outdated procedures? If there's a procedure that you know is out of date or is incorrect, now is the time to have that updated. Is there governance in your organization, such as management of change, that you know is not being followed? If so, stop. Stop right now, reset, and have everyone that needs to know about this document appropriately trained and aware of the document's existence and how to use it. An overarching process or procedure that's not being followed is of absolutely zero use to anyone. Do you know how you yourself, your team, your site, or your company are performing in process safety? How is that being measured? And how do you know what action that you need to take? So do you have a meaningful way of measuring process safety performance? It's very hard to do so, but it's very easy to get started. If you're a leader, if you've got any people that you're responsible for, when was the last time that you were told bad news? If you've not been told any bad news for a while, perhaps you need to be start being more proactive. Think back to the surveys and audits completed by BP. Do you know what the people on your front line actually think about process safety? When was the last time that you asked them? And when you did ask them, did you ask them leading closed questions, or did you ask them open questions that gave them an opportunity to give their opinion? And finally, think of an incident that took place in the past year at your organisation. What did you learn? And have these learnings been implemented? So on the 23rd of March 2005, 15 people tragically lost their lives and almost 200 were seriously injured. This disaster was no accident. This disaster was predictable and it was preventable. An accident is actually defined as an event that happens by chance or without apparent or deliberate cause. The causes of this disaster were absolutely apparent and they did not happen by chance. I think there was a deliberate avoidance of work that could easily have prevented this. Texas City is therefore not an accident. It's an incident. It could have and it should have been prevented. And I think that we must honour the memory of those lost by ensuring that incidents like this never happen again. Thank you very much. And just as a final point, if anyone would like to learn more about the Texas City disaster, I would encourage you to refer to any one of these sources here. And with that, I'll just skip. And anyone who wants to help visualize their instance like I showed there, please get in touch with me and we can talk about instant insight as well. So thank you very much. What I'll do now is I'll just read the Q&A and I'll see if there's any questions. And if anyone does have any questions, if you could put them into the Q&A, that would be wonderful. I'll maybe just wait a few minutes and see if anyone puts any in while that loads up. Right. Well, that's great. We don't appear to have any. Oh, there's some coming through. Well, the recording. Yes, we can make. Oh, I've been looking in the wrong place. Yes. So a few people have asked about the recording. Yeah, we can make that available to anyone that attended today. What I'll do is I'll just go back a few slides and I'll put up this one just so that everyone's got the info. Someone said, can you expand on some useful KPI for process safety management? Well, there's some really good documents by the UK Health and Safety Executive and by the IOGP that talk about how to get started on there. And there's two main parts. There's leading indicators and lagging indicators. A lagging indicator might tell you that something bad has happened, such as release of hydrocarbons, for example, of various size, or there's been an incident that was a near miss. You also get leading indicators that are slightly more reliable, but it can be hard sometimes to understand how they could lead directly to a major accident. And that might be things like, like plant safety excursions or key procedures that have been deviated from. And really what an organisation needs, there should be a good balance between leading and lagging indicators. And you can make sure that every major accident that your site is exposed to has some way of them being measured. But again, the Health and Safety Executive and the IOGP are really good places to get started on those. Someone's asked about what training should we give senior management on how to learn. There's no consensus in industry for this. My personal belief is that everyone in a position in an organization that's got financial responsibility and those decisions can impact process safety, there should be a set level of competence that person can have. So I would ask you, do your senior manager's job descriptions, does it have their process safety responsibilities built into that, or even just their general safety responsibilities built into their job description? And you find that many places don't have that. And again, we're very good at training and competency matrices for our frontline staff, but do we have those for those office-based staff, for our senior staff? And again, it's process safety on that. So I'd say it's probably for each organisation to answer themselves, But if it's captured in the job description and on someone's training plan, then at least that's a positive start. There's another one here. How much can we expect large organizations to enact these changes? Great question. And, large organizations like a big oil tanker, it's very, very difficult to get it to change direction. But what I've hopefully highlighted here and in many other major accidents that I've looked into or been part of investigating myself, the actions of any one individual or group of individuals might have actually been the difference between preventing accidents like this. So although it might be very difficult for an organization as a whole, especially a large organization, to change direction, we as individuals absolutely have the power to prevent these things. How much focus should there be on external regulators enforcing process safety management? This is a really interesting one because regulations or regulators are incredibly inconsistent across global locations or even different industries within different global locations. So for example, we see here in the offshore UK oil and gas industry, there's hundreds of assets offshore, but surrounding them there's an increasing number of offshore wind farms, but the regulations that deal with these are entirely different, and the actions that the regulator takes. So I always sort of say that we should have systems in place that it's not the regulator that's catching stuff. It's not the regulator that's asking us to do stuff. It's us asking them to do as ourselves that are identifying these things. Someone said, yeah, there's a lot of time passed since this incident. Lack of handover was a clear failing rather than improved systems. So absolutely. And in every single area of process safety, there's technology still can be paper-based right through. There's loads of fantastic systems in for handovers. I've seen things of digital signatures and recordings of handover. I think it's for each organization to put in place what they think's fit for use. If your company has an issue with handover, you should know you've got an issue of handover, and you should know about that because you're proactively examining the handover process. There's the plan, do, check, act cycle, which is certainly in place in the UK, and the check, act side of that means that you need to be looking for harm and then acting upon that. It seems the more I've dug into this, into Texas City, it's clear that BP did actually do a lot of digging into things, but they weren't acting on that. So, the answer is not to flood every area of process safety with technology. The answer is for you to find your own gaps and fill them as you see fit. I'll just see if I've forgotten any other questions. Oh, again, that's fine. Okay, if anyone's got any other questions, now's the time. Apologies if I've missed any. If I go to the chat as well. Oh my goodness, there's actually quite a lot in chat. So that's good. So that's fine. So if anyone's got any questions, you can contact me via email. You've hopefully got that, or you can find me on LinkedIn. If anyone wants to hear more about Instant Insight, if you just go to instantinsight.com, the address at the bottom right-hand side there. I'm always happy to talk about past process safety incidents, and I'd be keen to hear your reflections. So I think with that, we'll end things there. Thank you very much for attending, and I wish the rest of you a good day. Thank you.